A flight attendant disrespected a black CEO's son, but he calmly slid the jet ownership papers to the captain, leaving the entire cabin stunned. A flight attendant elbowed a black CEO's son, thinking no one would challenge him. He didn't realize the father had quietly slid the jet ownership papers to the captain, ready to assert control instantly. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true authority is prepared. The elbow came out of nowhere, as Kalen Vanton bent down to tuck his sketchbook under the seat, carefully placing it so the spiraled edge wouldn't catch against the floor. He didn't notice the shadow approaching from the aisle, but his father did. Dr. Jarrell Vanton's eyes, calm but calculating, tracked the flight attendant's stride as he moved deliberately closer than needed. Then it happened. A swift jab of the elbow struck Kalen squarely in the ribs. Not hard enough to bruise, yet, but precise enough to send a message. You're in my space. The boy gasped quietly, jerking upward and clutching his side, startled more by the act itself than the pain it brought. The cabin light shimmered off the brushed steel overhead bins, and for a heartbeat, the moment seemed to hang frozen in that narrow passage of air between intention and reaction. Jarrell didn't speak. Not yet. He turned his gaze slowly toward the man who had passed, already disappearing toward the galley at the front of Aryan Sky, Flight 418. The name stitched across the dark navy lapel read, Merrick Drayton. Jarrell's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something more measured, strategic. He placed his hand on Kalen's shoulder, grounding him, silently reassuring him with that firm touch. You okay? He asked softly. Kalen nodded, but his small hand remained pressed to his side. Jarrell noted that. He also noted the smirk on Merrick's face as he leaned against the service panel, whispering to another male crew member. They both glanced back toward row 1B. Dismissive. Calculated. Wrong. The boy in question was only 12. But the man beside him was the owner of the very aircraft model, now climbing toward its gate authorization review in the morning. Jarrell adjusted the slim black portfolio under his arm, an elegant piece of leather craftsmanship, worn smooth at the edges from years of executive travel. Inside it, secured in a velvet sleeve, was a sealed envelope bearing the silver insignia of Vanton Aeroworks. Ownership transfer documents. A bold acquisition move finalized just hours earlier, scheduled to be announced at the Global Aviation Summit in Velmora City tomorrow. No one here knew that. Not yet. Dramatic irony dripped from every second that passed as the father glanced around the cabin. Passengers seated nearby shifted uncomfortably. A man 2 rows behind looked up, caught the awkward energy, then quickly turned his face toward the window. Another man, mid-40s, sharp suit, eyed Jarrell with quiet curiosity but said nothing. Politeness is often the enemy of truth on airplanes. Everyone noticed. No one acted. Jarrell leaned toward his son again. Did he say anything? No, Kalinguisperth. He just did it. The way he said did it chilled Jarrell in a different way. It wasn't shock or confusion. It was the sound of a boy trying to believe it didn't matter. But it did. Jarrell straightened and reclined slightly into the premium seat's plush backrest. He tapped the portfolio once against his knee. Deliberately. The gesture was small, but it carried weight. Strategic instincts, honed from years in executive boardrooms and airspace infrastructure negotiations, began to slot into place. This wasn't about one elbow. It wasn't about service etiquette. It was about power, the kind taken for granted by those who didn't recognize it when it sat quietly in front of them. He pressed the attendant call button. The light blinked overhead, then flickered, then went out. Jarrell's jaw tightened by a single degree. No reaction on the surface. Only his right thumb, now resting atop the edge of the portfolio, tapped again twice, then stopped. Across the aisle, a younger attendant glanced at the interaction, but quickly looked away. Merrick remained at the front, leaning sideways with an arm braced against the bulkhead wall, whispering again, this time with a small shake of the head and a chuckle. Still watching, still calculating. But this time, Merrick miscalculated, because he wasn't dealing with a regular passenger, and he wasn't dealing with a man who would meet power with rage. Jarrell's strength didn't come in shouting matches or heated rebuttals. His strength came in timing, in legal clarity, in precision, like the clean mechanics of a jet engine operating on margins no wider than a breath. "Don't worry about it," Jarrell said to Kalen. "Just focus on your sketches." Kalen nodded, his voice quiet. "Okay." But Jarrell's eyes never left Merrick. The flight was not yet in motion, but the stakes had already taken off. Every moment became a calculation. Should he escalate now or wait for something more egregious? Could he afford a confrontation before takeoff, knowing the legal documents he carried needed to remain untampered and confidential until the summit? His instinct told him to wait, not out of fear, but because leverage used too early could vanish before the pressure peaked. Patience would preserve the outcome. The cabin lights dimmed for final boarding preparations. A voice on the intercom announced a slight delay due to a cargo discrepancy. Merrick walked past again, arms folded this time, jaw tight. Jarrell didn't flinch, but as Merrick passed Kalen, he made one last gesture, a quick, dismissive flick of his hand toward the boy's legs, as if brushing away invisible crumbs. It was subtle, petty, unnecessary. Jarrell saw it. He saw it all. The father adjusted the portfolio in his lap, angling it so the crease of the envelope's flap faced upward. He didn't pull it out. Not yet. But the moment had already begun to prepare itself like a wind shift before a thunderstorm. This would not end in silence. Not because Jarrell wanted confrontation, but because the man across the aisle had already written the script, and the climax was now inevitable. No one noticed the embossed silver emblem peeking from the edge of the folder. Not yet, but they would. They all would. The flight began long before the wheels left the ground. The elbow struck without warning. Kalen had only leaned forward to slide his small backpack farther beneath the seat. No sudden movement, no disruption, just a quiet adjustment to get comfortable. That backpack held his prized possession, a thick sketchbook filled with hand-drawn aircraft concepts, some modeled after his father's designs. But none of that mattered when Merrick Drayton brushed past with a tray and drove his elbow directly, sharply, into the boy's right side. It wasn't the accidental kind of bump. It was calculated, angled, forceful enough to draw a gasp from Kalen's lips. The sound wasn't loud, more of a quick intake of air, but to Jarrell Vanton, it was the audible signal of a line being crossed. His eyes locked instantly onto the retreating figure of the flight attendant. Merritt didn't look back. No epaligi. No josetaschen. He just kept walking, posture upright, jaw slightly tilted with the indifference of someone who thought consequences would never find him. That indifference made it worse. Jarrell's hand moved to his son's shoulder instinctively, not grabbing, not panicking, just anchoring. Kalen flinched lightly, but didn't cry out. His fingers hovered uncertainly over his ribs, and he kept his eyes low, not wanting to make a scene. Jarrell leaned slightly toward him. "You okay?" he whispered. Kalen gave a slow nod. "Yeah. Just surprised." His voice trembled more from emotional impact than pain. Jarrell didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His focus narrowed, his breathing slowed, and beneath that composed surface, calculations began. Behind them, a soft stir of discomfort swept through the cabin. A woman across the aisle frowned. A man in the row behind leaned forward, lips parted as if to speak, but then drew back. One passenger briefly met Jarrell's eyes, then looked away, pretending to adjust a headset. Jarrell knew that look, the look of people trying not to get involved. Merrick returned minutes later, slower this time, pretending to check the overhead bins. His gaze dropped briefly toward Jarrell's row, and a subtle, self-satisfied smirk curled at the corner of his lips. That smirk confirmed everything. This was no misunderstanding. Jarrell had seen power plays before, in boardrooms, in contract negotiations, even in government compliance hearings. But this one was different. This one targeted his son, a child, a quiet 12-year-old who had never asked for trouble. And now they were trapped thousands of feet in the air with the very people responsible. Kalen shifted again in his seat, wincing slightly as he tried to reposition. Jarrell noticed the movement, caught the tiny twitch of pain in his son's expression. He pressed the call button overhead. A soft chime echoed above them. Nothing happened. The light blinked, then dimmed. Seconds later, it turned off altogether. Jarrell stared at the overhead panel, then back at the aisle. Still nothing. The response delay was no accident. Instead of an answer, a different attendant approached, a tall, square-shouldered man with a name badge that read Race. He walked briskly past them, giving only a dismissive glance. "We're very busy right now," he muttered, then vanished in a galley. It wasn't just one man. It was a pattern. Jarrell's eyes stayed on the aisle, then turned to his son. Kalen rubbed his ribs again, quietly this time, his sketchbook now closed on his lap. "Tell me exactly what happened," Jarrell said softly. Kalen hesitated, then whispered, He came by fast with a tray, and I was leaning forward, and then he elbowed me. Like hard. I think it was on purpose. He didn't even stop." Jarrell absorbed the words, each one falling into place like puzzle pieces forming a disturbing picture. His anger didn't show, but it settled inside him like pressure building behind steel. He knew how to wait. He knew how to plan. With slow precision, he reached beneath the seat and pulled out the slim black portfolio. He didn't open it, just placed it vertically beside his leg, letting the edge of the seal remain visible. Inside it, the sealed ownership documents for the Aryan Sky 900X fleet sat untouched, but no longer dormant. He didn't need to show them yet. Not until the time was right. The hum of the aircraft's engines rose as the captain's voice came on over the intercom, announcing final preparations for takeoff. Passengers adjusted their trays. Belts clicked, but in seat 1B, something else had clicked too. The elbow, the silence, the dismissiveness, it had all set into motion something far more decisive. Jarrell's eyes followed Merrick as he passed once more through the cabin, pretending professionalism but exuding subtle contempt. The cabin had become smaller, tighter, not in size but in atmosphere. The cabin grew smaller when the elbow landed. Jarrell pressed the call button. The small amber light above the aisle flickered to life, then dimmed out with an unnatural blink. Not a slow fade or a gentle malfunction, but a snap of silence like someone behind the curtain had yanked its power. He waited a beat. Nothing. A second beat. Still no response. The quiet felt louder now. Footsteps approached, measured and dismissive. Drace Holland, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of trained detachment that could double as indifference, walked by. His crisp uniform and name tag gleamed faintly under the cabin lights, but his eyes refused to meet Jarrell's. "We're very busy right now," he muttered in a tone that made it clear he didn't care what the request had been. He was already past them before the words finished leaving his mouth. Jarrell didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward his son. Kalen had one arm cradled gently over his ribs, the elbow strike clearly more than a passing inconvenience. The boy's expression was controlled, but the subtle flinch in his brow said enough. Jarrell didn't need a verbal confirmation. His instincts, sharpened over years of boardrooms, negotiations, and navigating hostile rooms in expensive suits, registered the truth instantly. This wasn't about a cramped aisle. This wasn't poor service. This was control. This was assertion, and it was targeting his son. He leaned toward Kalen with care, his voice low and even. "Tell me exactly what happened." Kalen glanced toward the galley area, where Merrick had vanished, then looked back at his father. "He just came by with a tray, and I didn't move in time, but it felt like he aimed it, then said I should sit still." Jarrell nodded slowly, analyzing the rhythm of it. Intentional contact, no apology, a comment layered in authority. It wasn't a mistake. The elbow had purpose. The words were a test. Outside the window, the lights along the taxi lane rolled past in linear blurs. The hum of the engines deepened as the captain's voice crackled faintly overhead, announcing final checks before takeoff. But Jarrell's mind had already shifted away from flight paths and safety procedures. A different kind of calculation was underway. He reached slowly beneath the seat in front of him and pulled out the black portfolio. It didn't draw attention, not yet. It was quiet, intentional. He placed it upright beside his leg. The envelope inside, its seal unbroken, its crest embossed with the Vanton Aeroworks insignia, had traveled through more hands than most legal assets. Yet it hadn't once been misused. Until now. Now it had new purpose. Across the aisle, a man in 2D adjusted his phone slightly, angling it toward the front of the cabin under the pretense of watching entertainment. Jarrell noticed the reflection in his screen. Others were watching now. Not many, not overtly, but enough to shift the stakes. A pattern was forming, not just in the behavior of the crew, but in the reactions of those around them. He glanced back to the front of the cabin. Drace was there now, speaking quietly to Merrick. Their glances moved like metronomes, back and forth between their conversation and the first-row passengers, Jarrell and Kalen. The synchronization between the two attendants wasn't casual. It had the practiced ease of repetition. This wasn't the first time they had operated like this. One provokes, the other denies. One acts, the other disappears. It wasn't formal protocol, but it was clearly a routine. A hidden one, and they'd assumed it would go unchallenged again. Jarrell exhaled quietly, placing one hand on the edge of the portfolio. Not to open it. Not yet. Just to feel its weight. It grounded him, not emotionally, but strategically. Inside were the documents that confirmed him as the newly authorized principal shareholder of Aryan Sky's executive fleet division, a deal not yet public, not yet registered in the crew manifest, but binding nonetheless. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need theatrics. All he needed was the right moment. Evidence was building. Witnesses were aligning. And the abuse, veiled as policy or procedure, was beginning to fray under the pressure of scrutiny. Kalen leaned slightly against him, still cradling his side. The boy's sketchbook had slid halfway out of his backpack under the seat. A hand-drawn plane, angular and precise, peeked out from the pages. Jarrell gently pushed it back in with a quiet nod of encouragement. His son had only wanted comfort, curiosity, and a smooth flight home. Instead, he'd received dismissal, force, and an unspoken lesson in injustice. Drace glanced their way again, this time noticing the movement of the portfolio. His gaze lingered longer than before. Jarrell returned the look, not with challenge, but with knowing. And something in that gaze unsettled the man, just enough to make him look away first. The aircraft turned gently, aligning with the runway. The engines rose to a full roar, the cabin pressing backward with the force of acceleration. Jarrell didn't move. His fingers remained on the portfolio's edge. The envelope hadn't been touched, but its presence now shifted the air between them. It was a signal, quiet, unmistakable. A decision had begun, and its outcome would not be negotiated casually. Outside the window, the lights along the ground blurred into a single streak, then vanished as the plane lifted into the sky. Inside, Jarrell's patience had taken flight as well, but not without intention. Every moment was now under watch. Every word calculated. The silence that followed wasn't surrender. It was the pause before precision. The elbow had awakened something far more decisive. As the aircraft rolled toward the runway, Merrick Drayden reappeared in the aisle with the manufactured purpose of securing the cabin, a phrase that sounded routine but felt rehearsed and hollow in the moment. Without preamble, he leaned into row one with more force than necessary, his arm pressing hard against the edge of the armrest between the seats. The contact jolted Kalen sideways, forcing the boy to lean away from the pressure. His eyes darted to his father with a flicker of discomfort, not panic, not pain, but a child's quiet alarm. Jarrell Vanton's gaze locked instantly on Merrick's arm, his expression carved from pure restraint. He leaned forward, enough to close the space between himself and the attendant, enough to make avoidance impossible. "Move your hand," Jarrell said, his voice calm, but resonant with controlled authority. There was no emotion in it, no need for volume, just gravity. Merrick didn't move. He looked directly at Jarrell and offered a smile, thin, dry, smug. It was the smile of someone who thought he still had the upper hand, of someone who assumed his uniform outweighed the authority of the man before him. In that split second, Jarrell saw everything he needed: the dismissal in the eyes, the posture of subtle threat, the belief that power was visible and uniformed. But Merrick didn't know who he was dealing with. The aircraft's nose dipped slightly and then rose again as the engines surged louder. The moment of liftoff arrived, and the jet peeled away from the runway into the clouds. But on the ground, something else had already taken flight, the shift in momentum. Kalen sat back in his seat now, pressed slightly into the cushion, but his eyes remained wide. He was watching not just the window, but his father. Jarrell didn't respond to the smirk. Instead, he exhaled slowly, hands relaxed on his lap, posture composed. But his right hand drifted subtly toward the black portfolio positioned vertically beside his leg, tucked beneath the curve of his seat. The edge of the clasp glinted briefly under the soft cabin lights. In a single, silent motion, he drew it upward and onto his lap. The aircraft gained altitude. Jarrell loosened the magnetic flap, slowly and deliberately, and let the corner of the sealed envelope within slide just into view. The golden insignia of Vanton Aeroworks, embossed with subtle precision, peeked out like a quiet warning signal. He didn't open it. He didn't remove it. He didn't say a word. He simply placed his fingers against the leather and rested his hand there. To anyone else, it might have seemed like nothing. But to Jarrell, it was movement. It was declaration. It was the first play in a very deliberate strategy. Merrick had returned to the galley by now, unaware. He had dismissed the subtle tilt in the balance of the cabin. He believed he had asserted control through physical dominance, proximity intimidation, and dismissive tone. He assumed that the man seated with the quiet son was just another passenger he could mold into compliance. But Jarrell wasn't built for surrender. He was built for exactitude, leverage, and timing. The seatbelt light remained on as the cabin smoothed out into cruise ascent. Jarrell waited. This wasn't about emotion anymore. Emotion had no use here. This was about readiness, about the correct angle of execution. He had watched the movements of every crew member since boarding. He had taken mental notes on reactions, timings, spacing between offenses. He had marked the faces of witnesses, those who looked away, those who leaned forward, those who already began recording discreetly. He didn't need to draw attention now. All he needed was one more misstep, and the chain would be complete. Beside him, Kalen sat quieter than usual, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze flicking between his father's composed silence and the hallway where Merrick had vanished. He knew something had changed, though he couldn't yet name it. But he could feel it. The lights above them hummed faintly. The engine steadied into a low, powerful thrum. The sky outside was pale blue, veiled in mist and altitude. Everything in the cabin appeared normal. But inside Jarrell, the gears had already shifted. This wasn't just a father safeguarding his son anymore. This was a man of systems, hierarchy, and oversight initiating a procedural intervention. And the crew had no idea. They would not know, until it was too late, that the sealed envelope in that man's lap didn't just contain paperwork. It contained their consequences. And the moment Merrick had pressed against that armrest, he had already set the gears in motion. The sky carried the weight of a decision forming. The metal edge of the beverage cart scraped violently against Kalen's knee. The sound was quick, metallic, and sharp, followed immediately by the boy's startled jolt. Kalen recoiled on instinct, gasping and twisting his body sideways just before his shoulder nearly struck the seat in front of him. His breath caught in his throat. Jarrell's hand moved like a reflex, catching his son's shoulder and steadying him before the motion could turn into a fall. In that moment, the quiet hum of the cabin seemed to vanish beneath the father's rising focus. Merrick Drayden stood at the edge of the row, gripping the handle of the beverage cart with the same smug detachment he had worn since boarding. His face was calm, too calm. No apology, no glance at the boy, not even a flicker of concern. Instead, Merrick released a shallow, breathy exhale, like someone exasperated with a slow customer, then turned to adjust the placement of a cup on his tray as if nothing had happened. Jarrell didn't speak. He didn't blink. He merely held his son's arm gently in place, eyes locked on Merrick with a gaze that cut through the shallow performance. The energy in the cabin shifted. Something had been seen. 2 rows behind them, a man in a navy blue sweater leaned forward slightly the edges of a phone camera now visible from between the seats. Across the aisle, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses lowered his tablet slowly into his lap, angling it downward while keeping the lens directed toward the scene unfolding. And yet, Merrick continued as if the cabin were blind. Jarrell calmly moved his hand from his son's arm to rest in front of Kalen's knee. It was a small motion, a protective gesture, but in its simplicity, it carried a powerful message: no further. Merrick paused, his expression tightening just slightly. He had noticed, but rather than de-escalate, he leaned closer and muttered under his breath, "Cooperate, sir. We have rules." The line was delivered with the smug detachment of someone who believed structure was armor, who believed that his position, his uniform, and his authority shielded him from consequence. He believed that rules were something he could bend to fit his moods. Jarrell's eyes remained on him, unblinking, calm. But beneath that stillness, something shifted, a calculation, a precise mental click like a pressure valve being primed. He slowly sat upright, his posture composed, his movement deliberate. His expression did not shift, but the air around him grew heavier. Something in his stillness unsettled Merrick. Merrick straightened, turning his attention to the rest of the cabin, perhaps to reset his control over the space. He moved the beverage cart 2 rows forward, pausing to pour a drink. But it was clear to anyone watching closely. He glanced back. That glance was not professional. It was not courteous. It was a look of someone taking stock of how much power he had left in the room. And the answer was beginning to shrink. Behind Jarrell, murmurs started to ripple. Not loud, not disruptive, just subtle exchanges. "Did you see that? He didn't even check on the boy. Someone should say something." The witnesses were multiplying, and with them, a slow-burning alignment of truth. Kalen remained quiet, his small fingers now curled tightly into the fabric of his seatbelt. He didn't cry, but he looked up at his father, eyes wide, uncertain, waiting. Jarrell gave him a single reassuring nod. That nod said everything. "You're safe. I see it all. I won't let it go." Still, he did not rise. He did not press the button again. Not yet, because Jarrell Van Unn was not only a father. He was an engineer, a strategist, a man who had built his company by understanding systems, how each cog moved, how one misaligned gear could collapse a machine, and how precision, not impulse, won the day. He had already mapped this cabin like a control board. Every slight, every word, every witness, every movement, from the flickering call light to the scraped knee to the condescending mutters, each piece was being logged, not in anger, but in a pattern. The moment for action was drawing near, but it needed the right fulcrum, the right weight of consequence behind it. The hum of the engines masked the tension, but in Jarrell's mind, gears were turning. He let his fingers drift to the edge of the portfolio by his feet, brushing its surface with casual precision. Not yet opened, not yet revealed, but there, present, waiting. 3 rows back, another man quietly raised his phone. His thumb hovered, then tapped record. And up ahead, in the galley, Merrick paused again. He sensed something was shifting, but it was too late to retreat without consequence, and too early to realize he had already crossed a line he would not uncross. Jarrell turned his gaze back to his son, resting his hand again just in front of Kalen's knee. He whispered, "You're okay." Kalen gave the smallest nod. The cart clattered forward, metal wheels rolling across the aisle seemed like a countdown. But Jarrell no longer heard it as a threat. He heard it as rhythm, marking time, marking shift, marking the slow but steady arrival of justice already in motion. The cart rolled forward, but so did the father's resolve. Merrick reached over Jarrell's tray table without a word, brushing his arm across Kalen's shoulder to adjust a seatbelt that had already been properly secured. The contact was sudden and unnecessary, deliberate in its casual dominance. Kalen flinched, startled by the roughness, shrinking back into his seat instinctively. Jarrell's jaw tightened. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand, but the stillness in his body became louder than words. He stared forward, his reflection caught in the cabin window, watching not himself, but the two attendants whispering in the galley beyond the aisle. Drace Holland stood beside Merrick, speaking in hushed tones, stealing glances toward them. Their posture wasn't just irritated, it was predatory. There was no concern, no service in their stance. It was a quiet conspiracy, and Jarrell could see it clearly now. He pressed the call button again. The overhead light blinked to life, then dimmed and died. A flicker, then darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. Jarrell's hand hovered just above Kalen's shoulder, calming him. Behind them, a rustle. A man in seat 2D leaned forward and whispered just loud enough for Jarrell to hear. "That light's been messing up since you pressed it earlier. I caught on video if you need it." His voice was calm but firm, like someone who'd seen enough. In 3A, another man cleared his throat and subtly adjusted his phone, its camera lens peeking just above the tray table edge. Jarrell acknowledged both gestures with a slow nod. He would not be alone when the time came. Dramatic irony bloomed in full view. Merrick and Drace still believed they held control of the flight narrative. They didn't know the eyes around them were no longer passive. The passengers were watching, and more importantly, they were remembering. Drace approached again, a practiced smile stretched thin across his face. "Sir," he began, tone clipped, "you're pressing the call button too often. That's not necessary." Jarrell turned to face him, voice level, steady. "I'm requesting the captain." That sentence dropped like weight onto the aisle. Drace blinked. His forced politeness fractured for a brief second. The word captain wasn't one the attendants liked to hear, especially not from a passenger with an assertive tone and steady gaze. It broke the chain of authority they thought they controlled. "I'm afraid that's not how we do things," Drace said, retreating to practice deflection. "You can communicate through us." "There's no need to. I'm requesting the captain," Jarrell repeated. No raised voice, no emotion, but the repetition struck with the force of finality. Kalen looked up at his father, sensing the shift. The air between the seats grew heavier. Around them, silence formed, not the kind of silence born of comfort, but one forged from collective suspense. The flight crew had pushed too far, and now the atmosphere was listening. Dre's smile faded. "That's against procedure unless there's a medical or technical," Jarrell interrupted, calm and unshaken. "Then consider this procedural. I'm not making a request for comfort. I'm making one for safety. For my son's safety." Behind them, passengers whispered. A young man in 4C murmured. He asked twice. "They should call the captain." The older gentleman near the emergency row tilted his phone upward, hitting record. Drace exhaled sharply, his control slipping. "Sir, we're doing everything we can. If you continue interrupting operations, I may have to." Jarrell's eyes met his with unblinking stillness. "Document that threat carefully." That stopped Drace cold. The call button still glowed, faintly now, back from its earlier flicker. This time, it didn't go off. This time, someone was watching it function, and watching who ignored it. Foreshadowing bloomed like a slow sunrise, vivid and irreversible. The tide of silence was turning. And it wasn't just Jarrell's quiet resistance anymore. It was the passengers' phones, their eyes, their memory of every detail. Kalen sat quietly, unsure whether to be afraid or inspired. His father hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stood up, but something in him stood taller than any threat in the aisle. Jarrell reached calmly toward the seat pocket and slid his black portfolio a few inches out. He didn't open it, didn't even look down at it, just enough to let the slim black corner touch the light. Across the aisle, a passenger murmured to his seatmate, "Something's about to happen." Yes, something was. Drace took a step back, faltering, unsure if he should return to the galley or escalate further. But it didn't matter anymore. The turning point had been reached, not in noise, but in stillness. Jarrell leaned slightly toward the window again, watching the reflection of the cabin instead of the sky, studying every posture, every glance, every whispered exchange. His strategy was no longer a plan. It was movement in progress. Every variable was being documented. Every line of power was being exposed. And still, the attendants didn't fully understand. The moment for patience quietly expired. Merrick leaned beside Kalen and hissed. Children must follow instructions. Keep him controlled. The words weren't loud, but their intent cut sharply. His tone didn't carry concern. It was a warning dressed in authority. Kalen's breath caught. He shrank slightly in his seat, instinctively edging away. Jarrell shifted, his left arm sliding in front of his son with fluid precision. Not confrontational, not aggressive, but undeniably clear. It was the kind of movement that said, "This far, no further." His palm rested flat on the edge of the seat divider, a quiet shield. The cabin around them hummed, but every nearby passenger's focus had already narrowed to row one. Dramatic irony glimmered like tension before storm. Merrick stood over a man he still believed was a nuisance, some passenger he could intimidate into silence. What he didn't see, just inches away from his elbow, was the truth. Jarrell's portfolio sat firm on his lap, its magnetic clasp unlatched with a single finger. With practiced calm, Jarrell pulled the flap back just enough to reveal the edge of a thick, cream-colored envelope. The gold-embossed crest of Vanton Aeroworks peeked into view, elegant and precise. It wasn't waved, flaunted, or announced. It didn't need to be. Jarrell didn't look at Merrick. He looked at Kalen, whose wide eyes locked with his father's calm ones. "Breathe," Jarrell whispered to him, just loud enough for his son to hear. Kalen's shoulders dropped a fraction, his trust anchoring him. Jarrell then turned his head, his gaze slowly rising to meet Merrick's. The stillness in his expression wasn't passivity, it was the gravity of controlled force. Merrick didn't get it. He took the portfolio's revealed envelope as some empty show of paperwork, a hollow threat. He leaned closer. "You're making this flight difficult," he said, voice low, tone irritated. His mouth twitched with annoyance, the kind that grew when entitlement was challenged. Jarrell didn't flinch. "This flight was already made difficult. I'm only responding." Merrick scoffed but didn't answer. He turned to walk away, but Jarrell had already moved. His thumb hovered over the attendant call button above his seat. He pressed it firmly. The chime rang out again, longer this time, loud enough to draw eyes. It rang for 3 seconds. 4, 5. Passengers looked up. Some had seen Merrick's behavior. Others had heard enough murmurs to pay attention now. In row 2, a man with a tablet shifted slightly, lifting the device as if checking the screen, but the camera lens faced forward. A ripple of awareness moved through the rows. Merrick stopped a few steps down the aisle, visibly bristling. Jarrell's eyes didn't leave him. The call button's light blinked again, still no crew response. Kalen looked up at his father, uncertain. Jarrell gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "I'm here. I know what I'm doing." Behind them, Drace Holland stood rigidly near the rear galley, arms folded, eyeing the front of the cabin. His earlier whispers with Merrick now returned to memory, etched in every careful passenger's mind. Merrick turned his head slightly, pretending not to hear the call chime again, though the sound echoed just beneath the ambient engine noise. The neglect wasn't an accident. It was coordinated, but the coordination was sloppy, predictable, documentable. Jarrell reached down slowly and slid the envelope up just a little more, half visible now, its weight obvious, its presence undeniable. Vanton Aeroworks gleamed under the overhead light, a seal of leverage, a badge of silent authority. Still, Merrick didn't look back. Jarrell leaned back in his seat, not in defeat, but in certainty. His eyes remained calm, but his mind moved like a machine, processing every step. The elbow, the insult, the recorded silence, the ignored calls, the passengers' growing interest. Every factor aligned. This wasn't a random provocation. It was now a verifiable pattern. He turned slightly toward the aisle again and pressed the button once more, one long, deliberate press. He wasn't trying to cause noise. He was letting the moment echo. Passengers nearby tilted their heads subtly. In row 3, a teenager nudged his father and whispered something. The man frowned, eyes narrowing toward the attendants. Jarrell glanced sideways at Kalen again, gently brushing his thumb across the boy's wrist in reassurance. Almost there, he murmured. In the far aisle, one of the overhead cabin lights flickered, but no crew approached. The tension rose like pressure behind a sealed valve. Merrick and Drace had underestimated the cabin. They had misread silence for weakness. But silence was a gathering storm. Jarrell's plan had never been rash. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to demand. He only needed witnesses, timing, and truth. And now, all three were gathering like gears locking into place. Another man, seated diagonally in 2C, raised his hand slightly, as if about to speak, but then lowered it, watching Jarrell with a kind of quiet expectation. The father didn't move again. He didn't have to. The call light glowed above him. The envelope rested openly. Kalen sat straighter now, calm, still under the protective wing of his father's poised restraint. Everything had been set. The provocations were complete. The evidence was mounting. All that remained was the right voice to enter the scene, the one who could no longer be ignored. And Jarrell would make sure that voice arrived. The envelope's edge glimmered like the start of a turning tide. The attendant smirked, confident his act would go unnoticed, unaware that every signature, every legal right, and every command had already been handed to the one who could enforce it midair. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The chime rang again, soft but sharp. Heads turned. Yet Merrick and Drace remained still, arms crossed in silent defiance. It was the third time the call button had been pressed, and the tension near row 1 was becoming undeniable. And then, finally someone moved. Cassian Vale emerged from the forward galley, tall, older, and noticeably calmer than the others. His uniform was pristine, but more importantly, so was his demeanor, no aggression, no smirk, no tension in the jaw. He walked with the kind of authority earned over years, not the kind that leaned on arrogance. As he neared the row, his brows furrowed slightly, scanning the boy's rigid posture, the father's measured stillness, and the quiet stares from nearby passengers. "Is everything all right here, sir?" Cassian asked, his voice smooth but weighted with concern. Merrick, standing 3 steps behind, stiffened immediately. He didn't want this colleague involved, not Cassian. Cassian noticed details. Cassian wrote incident logs. Cassian had a memory like carbon paper. Jarrell's response came evenly, without pause. "I need to speak with the captain. Now." The words settled like dust after a dropped suitcase. Cassian blinked. That request was rare and rarely casual. He glanced at Kalen, noting the child's quiet tension, then back to Jarrell. The father's gaze was unwavering, calm, not the desperation of a disgruntled passenger, but the stillness of someone who had waited long enough. Cassian gave a brief nod, but just as he turned to move toward the cockpit, Merrick's hand darted out and gripped his arm. "Don't," Merrick hissed low, eyes wide with a frantic glint. "He's just trying to make trouble." Cassian froze for half a second. Then he looked down at the grip on his uniform. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled free. His eyes narrowed. "Don't ever touch me like that again," he said, loud enough for row 2 to hear. And without another word, he walked toward the cockpit corridor. Merrick's face went pale. The moment cracked open like a fault line beneath his feet. Drace, peering from a few rows back, adjusted his stance uneasily. Jarrell, meanwhile, remained composed. He slid the black portfolio from beside his leg and rested it on his lap. The clasp opened with a soft click. His fingers moved with practiced calm, revealing just a sliver of the envelope inside. A gleam of embossed silver caught the low cabin light. Vanton Aeroworks, the company crest unmistakable to anyone in the aerospace sector. Kalen shifted beside him. The boy's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Is everything okay?" Jarrell didn't look away from the front of the plane. He just placed his hand gently over Kalen's. "It will be," he replied softly. Near the galley, passengers watched with interest now. A man in 2D tapped his phone screen again, still recording. The tension had passed mere discomfort. It had grown roots. Cassian disappeared behind the cockpit door. Seconds passed. Not long, but every one of them felt like a string drawn tighter. Then, click, the cockpit door opened. Captain Rindler Dane stepped out into the aisle. Tall, composed, his hair dusted with silver at the temples. He scanned the front cabin like a man trained to read chaos in silence. He didn't speak at first. He just looked first at Cashin, who leaned slightly forward to murmur a few words into his ear, then at Jarrell and Kalen seated near the window. Finally, he noticed Merrick standing too stiffly near the exit row, eyes darting away. Jarrell did not move. He simply slid the envelope upward until it was fully visible, its seal unbroken, the emblem gleaming like a quiet signal flare. Merrick shifted. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. Dramatic irony hung in the air like cabin mist. The man they had tried to corner was, in fact, their superior by more ranks than they could imagine. Every passenger could feel the momentum shift. It was no longer about seatbelts or service. It was about truth, about consequences hidden behind tailored calm and an unassuming black envelope. Jarrell didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The truth was already walking down the aisle. The turning point stood right at the captain's doorway. The cockpit door clicked open, and Captain Rindler Dane stepped into the aisle with practiced poise, his stride firm but unhurried. His eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the cabin like radar, instinctively reading the tension pooled near rows 1 and 2. Cashin Vale leaned in close, murmuring something low in his ear while gesturing subtly toward the seated man and child at the front. The captain nodded once and moved forward. "Sir, I'm told there's a concern." Rindler's voice was composed, low, measured, not confrontational, but with the weight of command behind every syllable. He stood in front of Jarrell and Kalen, gaze flicking briefly between them. Behind him, Merrick Drayden hovered with his arms folded tightly, jaw clenched, his eyes darting like a man trying to act unbothered but failing. A faint tremor pulsed in his fingers, barely concealed. Just past him, Drace Holland leaned against a seat back a few rows down, attempting to appear disengaged while clearly listening intently. Jarrell didn't immediately answer. He reached down and lifted the sealed envelope from his lap, held between two fingers, upright. It wasn't a performance. It was control, pure and calculated. There was no rush, no aggression, just the air of someone who had already decided what mattered. Captain Rindler narrowed his eyes, puzzled. "What is this?" he asked, though his tone remained neutral. "Before I speak, Captain," Jarrell said calmly, "I need you to see this." The envelope was extended, slowly, respectfully, deliberately. Rindler took it without hesitation. His thumb brushed over the embossed crest, Vanton Aero Works. A wrinkle formed between his brows as recognition began to dawn. Merrick shifted suddenly, a half step forward, just enough to betray his unease. But he said nothing. The captain broke the seal and unfolded the first page. The silence around them wasn't empty. It was waiting. Line by line, the words settled into his awareness. Rindler's mouth parted slightly. His brow furrowed deeper. Confusion came first, then comprehension, then a jarring realization that hardened into disbelief. The weight of it settled into his shoulders. The passengers near the front craned subtly in their seats. Eyes that had been passive only minutes ago now watched every twitch of expression, every shift in body language. Phones tilted just enough to catch the moment, not obvious but not entirely hidden either. Captain Rindler glanced back down the aisle, then returned his gaze to Jarrell. His lips parted again, but the words didn't come. His fingers gripped the edges of the document a little tighter. He looked at Kalen next. The boy sat with quiet posture, small hands folded, one sneaker barely touching the floor. Then Rindler turned to Merrick. "Step forward," he said flatly. Merrick didn't move at first. He blinked, then took a step, more from instinct than obedience. His jaw worked, preparing words. But none came yet. The captain's breath caught as the truth unfolded in his hands. "Step forward," Captain Rindler Dane said, his voice cutting through the air like a wire drawn taut. Merrick Drayden didn't move at first. His jaw flexed, his shoulders locked in place, as if anchored by the sudden shift in gravity. The aisle, once his domain of control, now stretched before him like a corridor of consequences. Finally, with the reluctant jerk of a man out of options, he stepped forward from the galley bulkhead and came to stand near Jarrell Vanton's row, just close enough for everyone to see his discomfort. The captain didn't raise his voice, but each word was sharp, deliberate, and undeniable. "Did you place your hands or elbow on this child?" Merrick blinked. "Captain, did you interfere with a passenger's call request? Did you tamper with the cabin controls?" The words rang louder in the stillness, and this time, Merrick didn't have an answer ready. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, floundering somewhere between denial and justification. He was moving a lot," Merrick muttered finally. "I was trying to keep things orderly. Nothing physical, just procedural." The passengers weren't buying it. A man in row 3 leaned forward. "That's not true. I recorded everything, start to finish." Another voice, closer. "I've got footage too." The call light flickered and shut off. Merrick's eyes darted across the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, who might back him. But the silence that greeted him was louder than the voices. Drace Holland, standing a few rows behind, had gone pale. He looked away quickly when Rindler turned to glance his direction. The power dynamic on the aircraft had flipped, publicly, irrevocably. Jarrell didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence stood taller than any accusation. He sat composed, his hands folded around the black portfolio on his lap, the envelope tucked back inside as if the document had already done its job. Kalen remained close, quiet, watching everything with wide but steady eyes. His small hand gripped the armrest tightly, the ghost of discomfort still lingering in his fingers, his ribs, and his heart. Rindler turned back to Merrick, expression unchanged. "You understand what this document is?" he asked, holding up the now-folded transfer of ownership. Merrick nodded faintly, his throat working against dryness. I do now, sir." "Then you also understand that your behavior has been not only inappropriate, but in direct violation of chain of command and passenger rights." Merrick said nothing. He couldn't. His arms hung at his sides, shoulders shrinking with each passing second. The captain's gaze swept the nearby passengers. He didn't need to ask if they had witnessed the earlier scenes. Their faces said enough. Some looked indignant, others concerned, but all were unified in their judgment. Even those who had remained silent earlier now leaned forward, eyes lit with quiet vindication. Authority had shifted, and it was settling into the hands of someone who hadn't raised his voice once. Then, quietly but clearly, Rindler addressed Jarrell. "Dr. Vanton," he said, nodding with solemnity, "I see now what I failed to observe earlier. You and your son were subjected to actions no passenger, let alone the owner of this aircraft's operating fleet, should ever face." Jarrell gave a single, measured nod. "My concern," he said slowly, "has never been status. It has always been safety. For my son. For every passenger." Rindler's face held a flicker of regret. He looked once more at Merrick, then passed him to Drace. The second attendant was still half hidden, but now his posture betrayed him, arms crossed in defense, foot tapping anxiously, eyes locked on the emergency exit diagram, as if it offered some escape from responsibility. Merrick tried again. "Captain, but the words failed him again. A new shift moved through the cabin. Cashenvale, the senior attendant who had first listened to Jarrell without prejudice, stepped forward from the galley. He said nothing at first, but his presence felt like a silent confirmation of everything Rindler had now come to understand. Kalen's breathing was quieter now, his shoulders less tense. He looked up at his father, who placed a hand gently on the boy's back, a quiet shield still present. The cabin held its breath as authority realigned itself. "Merrick Drayton, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Step to the rear galley and await further instruction." The words struck like a bolt of clean lightning down the aisle. The tone of Captain Rindler Dane's voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Authority, when real, doesn't shout, it lands. Merrick's mouth parted slightly, as though he had something rehearsed to say, but no breath came. His face flushed a deep, burning crimson that clashed with the starched white of his uniform collar. For the first time since boarding, his confidence cracked, visibly, like a plate dropped too hard on marble. "Captain, he's exaggerating," Merrick began, but the words stumbled out half-formed, brittle. Rindler raised one finger without looking at him. Not another word. The silence that followed was deafening. Merrick's shoulders sagged. He took a slow step back, then another, until his back nearly brushed the forward bulkhead. His arms, once crossed with smug arrogance, now hung uselessly at his sides. He turned, defeated, and walked toward the rear galley without making eye contact with a single passenger. Drace Holland, still standing a few rows back, shifted his stance. His fingers laced together behind him, then unlaced. The unease on his face deepened. He had heard the words. He had seen the collapse. And he knew the line of accountability was walking toward him next. Rindler turned to Jarrell, standing with dignified calm beside his son. The captain's eyes, once narrowed in professional assessment, now opened with something closer to regret. "Dr. Vanton," he said quietly, "I sincerely apologize. I had no knowledge of this behavior." The weight in his voice was genuine. He meant it, not just as a formality, but as a man confronted by a reality his own crew had hidden behind layers of tone, proximity, and uniformity. Jarrell gave a slow nod, his voice low and even. "My request is simple. Ensure my son's safety for the remainder of the flight." Kalen looked up from his seat, his hands still tightly gripping the armrest. He hadn't spoken since the card incident. Now, he released a single breath. That sound, barely audible, was enough to move a ripple through the first few rows. Passengers murmured quietly. A man in row 3 leaned forward, whispering something to the man beside him. Another in 2D tapped his phone screen, still recording. Eyes that once darted away, now focused with purpose. The tide had shifted, and everyone on board knew who they believed. Cashin Vale, the senior attendant who had brought the captain forward, stepped beside Rindler. His expression bore no smugness, only calm inquiry as he turned toward the second figure of interest. "You're next," Cashin said, eyes locking on Drace. "Explain yourself." Drace's jaw twitched. He kept pressing the call button. Repeatedly. But the words lacked weight. There was no energy in them, no backbone. He looked around for support, but none came. Even the attendants in the rear galley now watched him with sidelong glances, distancing themselves. Jarrell remained still. He didn't press. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His silence had become the atmosphere. Every detail, every refusal, every elbow, every ignored button, every whispered instruction was now clicking into place around him like gears in a well-oiled system of consequence. Beside him, Kalen shifted forward in his seat and gently exhaled again. This time it was fuller. His breathing had changed. The tension in his young shoulders, so tightly coiled earlier, had begun to soften. And yet, the cabin was not fully at ease. Foreshadowing lingered in the way Rindler's brow remained furrowed, in the way Jarrell's fingers still rested near the edge of his portfolio, in the way Drace had yet to feel the full weight of his participation. The storm had passed its flashpoint, but the damage and the repair had just begun. Rindler straightened and glanced again at Jarrell. "Is there anything else I can do for you, sir?" The question was polite, sincere, but it came with the air of someone hoping to close a chapter. Jarrell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the moment sit, let it breathe. Then, after a long pause, he responded, "Yes, there's one more matter." Rindler's shoulders stiffened. He leaned forward slightly, voice low. "And what is that?" Jarrell's eyes held steady. "I'll address it when we land." The captain blinked once, nodding slowly. And with those final words, the tension returned, not as fire this time, but as pressure. Invisible, heavy weighting. The chapter hadn't closed. It had simply turned the page. The air felt heavier with the promise of what came next. The cabin steadied, but not with peace, rather with a humming current of something sharper, accountability. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was expectant. Every pair of eyes, once averted in passive discomfort, now followed the shifting tide with quiet attentiveness. Merrick's absence from the aisle was a vacuum everyone noticed. Drace lingered near the rear galley, posture uncertain, arms folded not out of confidence but containment, an anxious brace against what he now realized was an unraveling narrative. Cassian Vale, the third attendant and the only one whose presence had not bred hostility, knelt beside Kalen in the aisle. His tone was soft but sincere. "I'm sorry that happened. You're safe now." His hands remained visible, open-palmed on his thighs, signaling no threat. Kalen looked at him, hesitated, then nodded once, guarded but comforted by the absence of menace in this man's voice. Cassian didn't press further. He just gave the boy space, dignity, and a brief smile before standing and stepping back respectfully. Captain Rindler Dane remained by row 1, just behind the bulkhead. He had not returned to the cockpit. Instead, he stood like a silent sentry, a human acknowledgement that this moment mattered more than flight time. He didn't fidget, didn't rush. His presence was deliberate, calculated to assure. In his hand was the Nauri-sealed envelope from Jarrell Vanton. He extended it back with a subtle incline of the head. "Thank you for showing me. I understand everything now," he said, the weight of those words settling evenly between them. Jarrell nodded, taking the envelope without fanfare. He tucked it back into the black portfolio, which rested between his polished shoes. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. There was no need. Power didn't announce itself. It proved itself quietly. Around them, murmurs bloomed like cautious flowers. Passengers exchanged glances, heads leaned together. Some whispered what others were already thinking. "That's the man who owns part of this airline. That's his child." And those two attendants, they tried to humiliate them. The story of what had happened wasn't just spreading. It was crystallizing into a new narrative. One Merrick and Drace had lost control of the moment. They believed arrogance was safer than decency. Dramatic irony now wrapped itself like a shroud around the earlier posturing. Everything the crew had dismissed, the boy's discomfort, the father's calm warnings, the quiet insistence, had been pieces of a truth too large for their limited assumptions. But Jarrell wasn't done. As the aircraft hummed its way across blue altitudes, his mind was moving faster than the engines. He thought of Merrick's deliberate elbow, Drace's muttered dismissal, the call buttons that failed by design, the smirk, the defiance, the recordings. The weight of institutional consequence began to form in his thoughts, not just for this flight, but for the wider system that had allowed men like Merrick to treat human dignity as optional. He wasn't planning revenge. He was calculating reform. Every move ahead, fleet audits, HR incident tracing, updated behavior thresholds, would unfold with the same precision that had built Vanton Aeroworks into a dominant force in aerospace engineering. Accountability wouldn't be loud. It would be flawless. Beside him, Kalen shifted in his seat, now sitting upright again with less tension in his shoulders. His voice came softly, barely a whisper against the cabin's low hum. "Are we really okay now?" Jarrell turned to him and met his eyes. No platitudes, no promises he couldn't guarantee, only a firm hand that reached across the invisible lines drawn in the sky, grasping his son's in reassurance. "We're safe," he said, voice level and deep. But this story isn't finished. The horizon ahead carried accountability in its light. The wheels thudded against the runway at Velmora City International with a muted finality, the sudden jolt echoing through the cabin like a judgment passed. As the aircraft slowed and taxied along the light-lined corridor toward its designated gate, no one in the forward rows moved. It wasn't just the seatbelt sign that held them still, it was the weight of what had unfolded in the sky. Captain Rindler Dane stood near the cockpit door, his silhouette rigid, eyes fixed ahead. His jaw was tight, not in anger, but in control. Authority had shifted miles above the ground, and now it was time to cement that shift on solid pavement. Behind him, the low murmur of passengers replaced the drone of the engines. Eyes darted between row 1 and the rear galley. Some passengers whispered, others stared openly. A man near row 4 adjusted his tablet, still recording. The air itself carried tension, stretched taut across every breath. Near the rear, Merrick Drayton stood frozen in place, back pressed lightly against the galley wall. His arms were no longer crossed. His fingers twitched, and his eyes tracked the movements of the captain like a man watching a fuse burn. Drace Holland leaned beside the beverage station, pale and silent, lips thin as paper. They knew what was coming, even if they pretended not to. The chime for the seatbelt sign sounded with a sharp ding, and the light blinked off. But before anyone could rise, Rendler's voice filled the cabin through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone firm and level, "please remain seated. We will be conducting a brief internal procedure before deplaning." Gasps were stifled. Whispers bloomed again. But no one moved. No one dared. The implication was clear. Something had occurred on this flight that would not be allowed to pass unnoticed. Rendler stepped into the aisle, walking toward row 1 with even, deliberate steps. His eyes met Jarrell's, and the moment froze for just a breath. "If you're ready," he said in a voice just loud enough for nearby rows to hear, "I'll escort you both off the aircraft personally." Jarrell nodded once, neither triumphant nor cold. He rose, reaching first for the slim black portfolio still resting beneath his seat. He checked the seal with a glance, then extended a hand toward his son. Kalen stood with care, the edge of anxiety still visible in the way he clutched his small sketchbook under one arm. But his other hand held tight to his father's sleeve. As they moved up the aisle, a shift passed through the passengers. A man in 2D nodded solemnly. A younger man near 3A gave a silent thumbs up. Someone murmured, "Glad you stood up for him." Jarrell offered a simple nod of acknowledgement, his focus steady. At the front of the aircraft, the door opened with a quiet hiss. 2 uniformed airline integrity officers stepped aboard. Their appearance was immediate and precise. Navy jackets, black clipboards, silver pins on their collars. They didn't smile. They didn't hesitate. Their presence was as calculated as a chess move made 10 turns in advance. Merrick blanched visibly. The confidence that had once laced his smirk drained like water from a cracked cup. He looked to Drace, but the younger attendant avoided his gaze. It was every man for himself now. Captain Rendler approached the officers, his voice professional. "There was a behavioral breach during the flight. I filed a mid-air report detailing the chain of incidents. The involved crew member has been relieved of duty. I request immediate evaluation." He handed them a crisp, folded document, typed and signed. The officers took it wordlessly, one already skimming the contents as the other turned his gaze toward Merrick. There was no confusion on their faces. No hesitation. Only protocol, heavy as iron and just as final. Jarrell remained silent, observing the exchange with the same calm that had carried him through the entire ordeal. He didn't interrupt, didn't gloat. This wasn't about ego. It was about proof, about responsibility, about a father who had every tool to respond with power, but chose to respond with precision instead. Kalen stepped closer to his father, eyes wide, but no longer afraid. Whatever weight had pressed against his chest earlier in the flight had lifted. The protection he felt now wasn't just physical, it was structural, institutional, undeniable. Something had changed, and he knew it. One of the integrity officers stepped forward, addressing Jarrell directly. His voice was respectful. "We appreciate your patience. We will conduct a full investigation immediately." Jarrell's reply was quiet but resolute. "I'll be expecting thorough action." The officer gave a small nod. The moment was sealed, and as father and son stepped onto the jet bridge, their backs to the dimmed cabin and its shadows, the weight of justice followed behind. Around them, nothing moved but air. The jet bridge felt like the border between what happened and what would follow. The captain read the papers, paused, and immediately acknowledged the CEO's authority, leaving the crew stunned and the son safe. If you believe true authority combines calm, preparation, and decisive action, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.